Sunlight streamed across the kitchen table in slices, golden and soft, like it always did at that hour. Toast popped up from the old chrome toaster, slightly burnt, like always. She hummed something low, tuneless, a hand resting absently on her coffee mug. Peace settled into the room, unspoken but understood. The knock at the door cut through it like a blade. It was a firm knock, not the kind that waited for welcome. She paused, toast half buttered, and glanced toward the hallway. I was already rising, heartbeat ticking up. We weren't expecting anyone, not on a Tuesday morning. Not ever, really. Another knock, louder. I opened the door. 2 officers stood on the porch. A woman in navy blue, her badge flashing in the light, and a taller man behind her, expression tight. They asked for her by the name she never used. She walked into the room slowly, her robe trailing behind her like fog. No panic, no questions. She just blinked, twice, then said, "This is a mistake." But her voice didn't match her eyes. They weren't confused. They were calculating. The woman read her rights like it was a script she'd memorized long ago. She didn't resist. She held out her wrists like she'd been through it before. That's when the spell of morning broke, and I remembered the folder. The one I found last week, in the attic. And that's when I started to wonder. Who is she really? The officers stepped inside. Sunlight still clung to the doorway, reluctant to follow. She turned slightly toward me, chin lifted, and gave the smallest shake of her head. Like I should stay silent. Like I should know better. "I'm going with you," I said, the words automatic. "No," the female officer cut in. "You're not involved." The man moved toward her, pulling a small black box from his belt. The cuffs clicked softly, like a lock, sealing something older than this moment. "You are under arrest for identity fraud, attempted murder in the 2nd degree, and escape from federal custody," the officer announced. "You have the right to remain silent." "I know my rights," she interrupted, flat and calm. "You're making a mistake." It wasn't a plea. It was a performance. She looked at me once more as they turned her around. A glance, like a dare, or a goodbye. I stood there, anchored by the sudden weight of what I hadn't understood until now. And then, I remembered. The folder. I rushed to the bookshelf and pulled it out from behind the old cookbooks. Manila creased, labeled in handwriting I didn't recognize. I handed it to the officer. He opened it, eyes scanning. His jaw stiffened. "You found this?" I nodded. "Last week, in the attic." He gave the briefest nod. "You did the right thing." But it didn't feel right. When they let her out, the air seemed colder. She didn't look back. She didn't speak again. I collapsed into the nearest chair, one hand gripping the backrest like it was the only solid thing left. My knees had gone to water. My mind buzzed with everything I'd missed. Every moment I thought I knew her. Every breakfast, every lie. The quiet had been a trapdoor all along. Here's the draft for the next 2 scenes. The house felt quieter after the door closed behind them. The kind of quiet that makes your bones ache. A silence so thick you almost expect it to suffocate you. The place we once called home, where every picture and every corner had a memory, now seemed like a crime scene. I walked through it slowly, my footsteps sounding too loud on the hardwood floors, like they were echoing all the things I hadn't heard. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, staring at the counter. The mug she'd been drinking from was still there, half full, half warm. I touched it, only to pull my hand back as if it might burn me. I started walking. The living room first. The couch where she'd slept late on Sundays, always sprawled out like she didn't have a care in the world. I lifted the cushion, searching. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I found it. A small stack of DVDs. Shows we'd watched together, except they weren't shows. The DVDs were surveillance footage from our street, from our house. Close-ups of the front door, the back porch, even the windows. I felt the first twinge of betrayal, something jagged inside my chest. The living room felt too cold now, too empty. I moved to the hallway. The coat closet caught my attention. Her things were still hanging there. Her jackets, scarves, the smell of her perfume lingering faintly, but tucked behind them were the forged IDs. A stack of them, neatly stacked in a plastic bag. Not just a fake driver's license, but passports, social security cards, documents. A lifetime of falsehoods crammed into a single inconspicuous spot. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I just kept walking. I opened the bedroom door, eyes scanning. I didn't want to see it, but I had to. There, on the nightstand, a pile of unopened mail. Nothing important, just bills, just letters. But they weren't for her. They were for someone else. Another name. I felt the anger start to curl in my stomach, quiet at first, but growing, like smoke that's spreading through a house that's already burning. I walked to the front door, hands gripping the frame, staring outside. The lawn was untouched, the trees still swaying gently in the breeze. It all looked so normal, so ordinary. And yet everything had changed. I was told to stay away from the arraignment, to leave it alone. But the more I stood there, the more I knew I couldn't. I wasn't sure if I was looking for answers or just looking for her. But I was going. The courtroom was sterile. The walls were too white, the air too still, the chairs too hard. Everything about it felt cold, like they designed it to drain the soul right out of you. And yet there she was, Talia. She looked different here, stripped down. No soft robes, no morning smiles. Her eyes were sharp, focused, dangerous. Like she could see right through the room, through the judge, through me. She was still wearing that mask, but it was thinner now, barely hanging on. The moment her eyes found mine, I saw it, just a flash, but it was enough. Her gaze locked with mine. No words, just a hollow, silent exchange. There was no recognition, no apology, just that cold, clinical stare. The judge called her to speak. Her voice rang out in the tiny courtroom, low and controlled, but every word hung in the air with a weight that didn't match the charge. Not guilty? I hadn't expected anything else. Still, the words hit me like a slap. Not guilty. Even now, she was still pretending, still playing the part, still wearing the mask. I watched her, but I wasn't sure what I was seeing anymore. She was standing there in front of me, but the woman I thought I knew was gone. There was no trace of the person I'd lived with, no trace of the person I'd loved. I sat there watching her, drained. There was no triumph in her guilty plea, no victory to claim. I didn't feel anything but the crushing weight of the truth. The mask was slipping, but I wasn't sure what would be left behind. The courtroom had become a theater of truths, half-truths, and lies, each side vying for control of the narrative. The prosecutor stood tall, confident, poised like a master puppeteer pulling invisible strings. His voice rang through the room as he detailed the evidence, a tight web of premeditation, forgeries, and surveillance that seemed to circle back to one undeniable fact. Talia had built a life on lies. There are dozens of forged IDs, countless pieces of fraudulent documentation, surveillance footage of the victim's every move. We have no doubt this woman is guilty of attempting murder, as well as the long-term manipulation of the person she called her partner, the prosecutor said, his gaze fixed on Talia, who sat motionless, unmoving. The evidence was damning, each piece confirming what we already knew, but it wasn't just facts that mattered. It was what they left out. The defense attorney, a wiry man with a too tightly pulled tie, shot to his feet next. He spoke with an intensity that tried to soften the blows of the prosecutor's case. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we must consider the possibility that this woman's actions were the result of extreme emotional trauma and instability. The defendant has suffered years of manipulation, abuse, and psychological warfare. She was not acting with full faculties. She was acting out of fear. He paused, glancing at Talia, who remained impassive. She is a victim. She is a product of circumstances far beyond her control. It felt like the air in the room shifted with his words, like the space between truth and illusion was slowly expanding. I could see where this was going. I knew that defense. It was the same one she'd used on me, the same one I had fallen for again and again. The carefully orchestrated story she told, the half-truths that she wove into our lives like threads of silk, soft and persuasive. She had a way of twisting my thoughts, manipulating my emotions, always making me question whether I was the one who was wrong. The prosecutor presented the footage, clip after clip. My hands clenched around the arms of my chair, knuckles white. There she was, the woman I thought I knew, hiding behind that mask. Her face, so calm, so calculated, was the same face that had once smiled at me across the breakfast table. But the footage showed something else. The way she'd watched me, followed me, always planning, always observing. I couldn't escape it now. The lies were everywhere. Then the psychiatrist's notes were read aloud. The room went silent, and I could feel every eye in the courtroom turn to me. Talia Andrews, the prosecutor read, is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, marked by chronic instability, manipulation, and an intense need for control. Her behavior is consistent with the pattern of someone who uses others as tools to manipulate their environment, without regard for the emotional toll on those involved. The words hit harder than anything else so far. Borderline personality disorder, manipulation, control. They all resonated in a way I hadn't expected. The doctor had seen it. The psychiatrist had recognized it long before I had. And I had been the one who let it slide, the one who refused to see the truth, even as it burned through every part of my life. The final blow came when the psychiatrist's report revealed the most damning detail, that Talia had been playing a game all along. She had made me the pawn. I couldn't breathe. The truth, cold and stark, settled in my chest like a stone. Talia's mask had slipped long ago, and now, so had mine. The air felt thicker as I took the stand, each movement more deliberate than the last. I felt eyes on me, the entire courtroom silent, waiting. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The weight of it all settled in my chest like lead. But I knew I had to speak. I had to tell the truth, even if it tore me apart. The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence, sharp and clear. Please, state your name for the record. Jason Carter, I said, forcing the words out. Mr. Carter, could you tell us about your relationship with the defendant? I nodded, swallowing the knot in my throat. I'd rehearsed this in some way, but nothing could have prepared me for how it would feel to say it aloud. I met Talia 3 years ago, I began. It was casual at first. She was charming, beautiful, everything I wanted. We moved in together after a few months and things seemed perfect. At least that's what I thought. I hesitated. There were gaps in my memory, spaces between events that never seemed to fit. I didn't realize it then, but I should have. There were signs. So many signs. Talia was different, I continued. She'd get sick sometimes. At first, it seemed normal. A cold here, a flu there. But the illnesses, they didn't add up. There were days when she couldn't get out of bed. Days when she'd complain of pain that seemed to come and go without explanation. I'd rush her to the hospital and the doctors would never find anything. It wasn't normal. But she convinced me it was just stress. It was just the pressure she was under. I believed her. I could feel the weight of her eyes, even from across the room. I knew she was watching me, but I couldn't look at her yet. Not like this. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to push through. We got married after a year. She seemed fine, normal. But there were gaps that I didn't understand at the time. I let the words linger. I found things, documents, receipts, letters. None of it made sense, but I still couldn't put the pieces together. I wanted to believe. I wanted to trust her. I glanced at the jury. They were listening intently, some of them nodding, others still, like they could sense the storm beneath my calm words. I didn't know how to make them understand, how to make anyone understand what it had been like to live in that house, under that spell. But then, there was the night I found the first real clue. I said, voice trembling slightly. I came home early one evening. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I'd forgotten my keys, so I had to use the spare. I found her in the bedroom, talking to someone. She was on the phone, but it wasn't just a regular conversation. She was plotting, planning. I heard her say something about needing another passport and more time. It was then that I realized the woman I'd been living with wasn't the woman I thought she was. The room seemed to shift, a ripple of disbelief, of tension, of realization. I was starting to see the truth in full now. The lies had stretched over every part of our lives, thin as paper, but strong enough to hold me in place. I confronted her that night, I said, my voice quieter now. I asked her what was going on, and she just looked at me. Calmly. She said it was nothing, that it was all a misunderstanding. She said I was imagining things, but it wasn't a misunderstanding. I kept pushing, kept asking questions, and that's when she told me the truth. I paused, remembering how it had felt. She told me she was living two lives, that everything she'd ever told me was a lie. Her name, her past, everything. It was all fake. I wasn't the only one she was manipulating. She had done this before, with others. There was a long pause in the courtroom, a heavy silence, almost like time had slowed down, until I spoke again. She told me that I was just another victim in her game. And I was. I was just another person she'd used, another pawn in her manipulation. I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with Talia. I don't know why I did it, but I couldn't stop myself. Her gaze met mine, and it was like a moment stretched out forever. There were no words exchanged, no defense or excuse, just the raw, unfiltered truth that hung between us. I could see it now, clearer than ever. The mask had cracked, but it didn't fall. It just slipped. Her eyes didn't show regret, didn't show remorse. There was no apology, just that same calculating calm, the same indifference I had seen in her when the officers arrived at our door. But this time, it was different. The trust she'd weaponized against me, the control she'd held so tight, was finally slipping away. The illusion was shattered, and I wasn't going to be part of it anymore. I turned back to the prosecutor, my voice steady now. She wasn't just manipulating me, she was manipulating everyone, but she won't do it to anyone else. Not anymore. The words felt like they came from someone else. The version of me who had believed her, trusted her, was gone. And with that, I told my story. The courtroom was still when the jury returned. Every person in that room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the hammer to fall. I sat there, trying to keep my hand steady on the table, but the tremors wouldn't stop. The air felt thick, as if the weight of it all had somehow transferred to the space between the walls. The foreman stood up, his voice cutting through the silence. We, the jury, find the defendant, Talia Andrews, guilty on all counts. There it was, the words that I had both feared and needed to hear. My mind was too numb to feel anything but the pulse in my temples. Guilty. Guilty of everything. Talia didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her expression remained cold, unreadable, like she was waiting for something else. A shift, perhaps. A chance for someone to finally see her as the victim she always claimed to be. But there was no more doubt now. The truth had been laid bare. The judge didn't waste time. The sentence was swift, almost mechanical. Talia Andrews, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison for identity fraud, attempted murder, and escape from federal custody. A psychiatric evaluation will be conducted prior to your incarceration. The court will determine the appropriate course of treatment. The words rang in my ears as if they were someone else's. 25 years. It wasn't the justice I'd imagined in those sleepless nights after everything fell apart. It wasn't enough, but it was something. A closure that felt hollow, like the final page of a book I wasn't ready to finish. I watched as they escorted her out of the courtroom. There was no moment of regret, no sign of weakness. She just moved, her movements graceful and deliberate, like she had practiced this exit 1,000 times. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everything shift in my chest. The reporters were already gathering, their cameras flashing, their voices eager. But I didn't answer. I didn't turn to face them. I just walked out of the courtroom, the noise of the world rushing in behind me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was chasing anything. I wasn't running towards something or someone anymore. I had reached the destination I didn't know I was headed for, and it felt like nothing. The house was too quiet now. It felt almost unfamiliar, like someone had swapped out the walls, replaced the floors, but forgotten to tell me. I stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at the space that had once been hers and mine. The faint smell of paint hung in the air, mixed with the scent of fresh wood and cleaner. I had started the process the day after the verdict, repainting every room, replacing the furniture, erasing every trace of her from the corners and the walls. I didn't want to keep anything that carried her ghost. I had always thought of a home as a reflection of the people inside it, a mirror of who we were together. But now, it felt like an empty frame. I needed to create something new, something I could breathe in without the suffocating weight of the past hanging over me. I moved through the house methodically, replacing the old couch with something simple and clean. The dining table, one she had picked out herself, was gone, replaced by a smaller, less ornate one that felt mine. I couldn't stand the idea of sitting at that table again, of pretending we were still a family. It was better this way. The walls would be bare for a while, but it would be the start of something real. Something I hadn't been able to find until now. As I scrubbed down the old shelves, a ding sounded on my phone, a text. I opened it expecting something routine, bills, reminders, but it was from a number I didn't recognize. "Hey, just wanted to check in. Heard about the trial. Tough stuff. If you ever want to talk, let me know." The name at the top didn't ring any bells, but it didn't matter. The message was vague enough to be familiar. The same people who had wanted to be close to the drama, who had fed off the chaos and the headlines. They had watched the fall from a distance, now eager for any piece of the aftermath. Another message came in, this time from an old coworker I hadn't spoken to in months. "Still can't believe what happened. You okay? I'd love to grab coffee sometime if you need someone to talk to." I stared at the screen for a moment, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The desire to respond, to reach out, was there. But the truth was, I didn't need them. Not now. Not in this moment. I had no interest in reliving it all. I wasn't interested in being a spectacle. I wanted peace, clarity. I deleted both messages without responding. The cycle of drama could keep spinning on without me. It wasn't long before I made another step, an appointment with a therapist. I'd resisted the idea for months, afraid that it might be an admission of weakness, but now, I realized it was more of an admission of strength. The decision wasn't about fixing something broken. It was about growing, about becoming the person I needed to be. When I walked into her office, I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. I hadn't realized how much I was holding on to until I sat down in front of her. She was older, with kind eyes and an open expression, and she had a way of making the space feel less like an interrogation room and more like a quiet place to be. We talked about everything. My marriage, my trust in Talia, my guilt, the constant pull between wanting answers and knowing I would never get them. "I've been trying to figure out where I went wrong," I said, my voice lower than I intended. "I keep thinking I should have seen it, should have noticed the signs." She looked at me, not with pity, but with understanding. "You weren't stupid," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You were honest. That's the thing. You trusted her because you believed in her. You weren't fooled. You just gave her the benefit of the doubt, even when the truth was hard to see." I blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't a fool. I hadn't missed the signs, I had just trusted too deeply. That was the hardest part to accept. I had loved her, believed her, because I wanted to, because that was who I was. But I should have known, I whispered, more to myself than to her. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You trusted her because you believed in what love was supposed to be. You believed in the truth, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem isn't with you. It's with how she chose to twist that trust." I nodded slowly. Something in me shifted, as if the puzzle pieces I'd been chasing for so long were finally starting to fit together. Maybe it wasn't about me trying to fix myself or salvage something that was never real. Maybe it was about understanding that I wasn't broken, just changed, and I could rebuild from that. When I left her office, it felt like I was walking in a new skin, one that wasn't shaped by her lies but by my own clarity. The silence in the house wasn't empty anymore. It was mine. And in that silence, I could finally hear myself again. It was a quiet morning when I laced up my sneakers and headed out the door for the first time in months. The pavement felt different under my feet. Solid. Familiar. Running had been something I used to do with ease, but after everything had happened, I hadn't been able to bring myself to try again. It felt like the first real step forward. The air was cool, the sun just starting to rise, casting a soft orange glow over everything. I didn't push myself to run fast or long. This wasn't about setting a goal. It was just about moving, about putting one foot in front of the other and reminding myself that I still had the power to make choices, to feel my body move again. As I ran, I let my mind wander, not to the past or the chaos, but to the present, to the fact that I was here, doing something for myself, something that didn't involve Talia, or the trial, or the mess of lies I'd lived through. The rhythm of my feet against the ground became a kind of meditation, a way to feel the tension that had built up over the past year slowly release. I wasn't running away from anything anymore. I was running towards something. Peace. Later that week, I found myself standing at the door of a small local bookstore, hesitant for a moment before pushing it open. There was a sign that read, "New Book Club. All are welcome." The words felt like an invitation, not just to the group, but to something more. Connection. I'd been missing that. The kind of connection that didn't involve secrets, games, or manipulation. Just people. I signed up, nervous and unsure. The first meeting was awkward, the small talk forced. But over the next few weeks, something began to shift. I found myself looking forward to the discussions, to the camaraderie. The members were all different ages, backgrounds, personalities, but there was one thing we shared: a love of stories. That's when I met Elise. She was quiet at first, content to listen rather than dominate the conversation, but there was something about her that drew me in. She didn't try to fill every moment with words, didn't rush to fill silences. Instead, she let the pauses breathe, and I found myself appreciating the way she listened, the way she gave people space without judgment. The connection between us was gentle, slow. It wasn't about expectations or promises, and certainly not about the need for something dramatic. It was simple, a shared glance over a book we both loved, a quiet laugh at a joke no one else understood. There was no pressure, just two people who enjoyed each other's company, who didn't need to define anything just yet. But even as I let myself enjoy her presence, there was a part of me that still watched the shadows. I'd catch myself scanning the street as I walked to my car, looking over my shoulder when I entered the bookstore, a reflex that had become so ingrained I didn't even realize I was doing it. At first, I thought it was fear that someone, anyone, would show up, someone who had the power to unravel everything I'd worked so hard to rebuild. But over time, I realized it wasn't fear anymore. It was instinct, a part of me that had been shaped by Talia's manipulation. A part that still thought I needed to protect myself from whatever danger might lurk just out of sight. But each time I looked over my shoulder and saw nothing, I felt something else. A small shift, a whisper of relief. Maybe the shadows didn't mean danger anymore. Maybe they were just shadows. And I could walk through them now without feeling like I was constantly waiting for something to strike. It wasn't a perfect feeling, and it didn't come all at once. But with every passing day, I could feel myself relearning what safety felt like. It wasn't a thing that could be found outside of me. It was something I had to create within, something I had to allow myself to believe in again. Elise was part of that, a reminder that connection didn't have to come with strings attached, that there were still people in the world who didn't want to take from me but simply wanted to share in something real. I wasn't healed, not yet, and maybe not for a long time. But every day I took a small step forward. I ran, I laughed, I listened, and most importantly, I let myself be seen, without the shadow of Talia hanging over me, without the fear that I might be fooled again. It was a slow process, but it was real. And that was enough. The folders sat on the small desk in my study, tucked away behind books I rarely opened and papers I never looked at. It was a nondescript manila folder, the kind that holds memories not in photographs or letters, but in scribbled notes, fragments of truth that I was still piecing together. It was the only thing left from that part of my life with Talia, and yet it wasn't really about her anymore. It had started as a way to keep track of everything. The things I couldn't forget, the things I was too scared to face, the lies, the manipulations, the moments that didn't add up. But over time, as I worked through the wreckage, I began to fill the folder with something else. Reflections on my own strength. Not hers, mine. I had written in the margins of pages where I'd once cataloged her behavior. Notes to myself about resilience, about the things I had learned through the chaos. You didn't break. You walked away. You were enough. Simple words, but they had taken time to feel real. Each note felt like a small victory, a reminder that despite the storm, I was still standing. The folder had become my compass. It no longer held just the weight of her lies. It carried the memory of how I had found myself again, piece by piece. I picked it up now, flipping through the pages until I came to the one I'd revisited most often, the note she had left me once. Written in her familiar looping handwriting, "You make the best pancakes." When I first read it, months ago, it had left a bitter taste in my mouth. I could almost hear her voice saying the words, the fake sweetness she'd wrapped around everything. It had been just one more thing, one more tiny piece of her manipulation that had seemed innocent at first, but in hindsight was nothing more than a distraction, a way to keep me off balance, to keep me invested in the illusion. But now, as I read it again, there was no sting, no anger, no sorrow, just a strange kind of peace. I realized that it wasn't the words that had hurt me. It was what they represented. The illusion she had built around me, the way she had twisted everything into something false. I didn't need to carry that anymore. I didn't need to carry any of it. The note wasn't a wound anymore. It was just a memory. A part of my life I had learned to let go of without regret. The morning light streamed through the window, casting soft beams of gold across the room. I closed the folder and set it down on the desk, taking a deep breath. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about seeing it for what it was and finding a way to move forward. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, where the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. I poured myself a cup and carried it to the small table by the window, the one I had carefully chosen after the furniture swap. The world outside was quiet. Just the sound of birds in the trees, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could simply breathe, without the weight of fear or doubt pressing down on me. I took a sip of coffee and watched the world outside, feeling the simple peace of this morning, of this life I was slowly rebuilding. There were still scars, still reminders of what had happened, but they no longer defined me. They no longer held the power they once had. I was learning, slowly but surely. The small steps were adding up, and with each one, I felt stronger, more certain. The road ahead wasn't clear, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, I didn't need it to be. I was learning to walk it at my own pace. I was still running, but now my eyes were open.